Hi, my friends. I'm here. The sun is going down again. Well, something it does every day. I'm here with the 1921 diary entry for the day. We're up to the 10th of January on the old Russian calendar and the 28th of January on the Western calendar. It's a Monday, and of course we're in Paris, and of course Dmitri needs to make sure that his address is right there at the top of the diary entry, 76 Rue Miromesnil. It has not changed. Okay, so we have, once again, in this diary entry, him going off to the theater to see his favorite performance, this Russian review called The Bat. So because that comes into the diary entry today, among other things, I would like to play a little of the music for you, just a few seconds worth. So this particular song from the review is called The Songs of the Black Hussars. And it starts out with a little spoken a speaker right before the song itself starts. And if you go to my Facebook group, Grand Duke Dimitri's Diaries, then there's a link posted there. But I love this song so much, and it is so central to this diary entry that I want to play just a little bit of it. So don't tune out. Here it is.
The songs of the Russian Black Hussars, which are sung in the Tsar's time. Now, there are no Black Hussars in Russia. Owing to the great Russian Revolution, the Black Hussars have become the Red Hussars, like lobsters.
Okay, I'm going to turn that way down. It makes me nostalgic, and I never even experienced Imperial Russia. Okay, so here we go, starting with the diving into the diary entry. General Galeevsky came to see me in the morning. Then I went to Maria's for breakfast. Old Betsy Shuvalova was there. She's very sweet and has hardly changed at all, except that she looks even more like an old gypsy. Afterwards, I stopped by May's and we went together to buy tickets for the Moscow review The Bat, directed by Baliev. Then we went to have tea with her friend, a doctor's wife, whom we had seen a lot of in Monte Carlo, Madame Faber. I call her Aunt Sonia. She's a marvelous Ukrainian woman and has not lost her accent despite having lived in Paris for 20 years. I stopped by the Vichfelds. There was a terrible fuss there because Maybelle's child had unexpectedly fell ill. I dined with May at Maria's, and then we all went to the Bat. I love every bit of it. It has absolutely kept the Moscow spirit. In the bar, they had set up a Russian buffet where the waiters, dressed in blank, served vodka. From the theater, I stopped by to see Pete Polovtsov at the Travelers. We had a very nice time there. All right, so that's that diary entry. Okay. General Galeevsky has been mentioned in the past. He was part of the monarchist political movement in emigration, and so he comes to see Dmitri in the mornings fairly often. But apparently he didn't have anything particularly exciting to say that day. And then, as usual, Dmitri is off to his sister's house. Now, his sister seems to have received more, or at least a greater variety of people than he did. So she's got this visitor here who is old Betsy Shuvalova. So one of the most prominent aristocratic families in Russia, the Shuvalovs, and they were counts and countesses. So she was a countess. Her name in Russian was Elizaveta, but she's using the English diminutive form Betsy. So actually, we have something written by Alexander Polovtsov, Pete's brother, about Betsy Shuvalov, and like Dmitri, he calls her very sweet. So she must have been just a warm, nice woman. And he notes that she was unlucky in her marriage, and I guess it was because he didn't have children, or she didn't have children. I don't know if she had any cats, but she didn't have children. And because her husband, in Alexander's estimation, was weird. Okay, but when she was widowed, fairly early on, she became rather hedonistic herself and was on the scene in Petersburg in a big way, on the party scene, if you will. But now she seems to be this very sweet woman who's been living in Paris for 20 years, and to Dimitri's delight, oh wait, she's not the one who was living in Paris for 20 years. Okay, but yeah, she's hardly changed at all, except, well, he just has to get a dig in, doesn't he? She looks even more like an old gypsy. Okay, yeah, I saw some photos of her online. I don't think she looked like anything in particular, except just a woman from that time period. So I'm not sure what he meant by that. So then he stops by May's. This is very consistent with his habit, which we've already noted, that when he doesn't have anything particular to do on a given day, he just stops by. He stops by to see the Vichfelds. He stops by to see May. He stops by to see Pete at the Travelers. And that's the word he uses when it's typically not planned out, although it sounds like it may not have been spontaneous in the case of May, or it may have been spontaneous. She is at home and they go together to buy tickets for this Moscow review, and I think Dimitri's already seen it 3 or 4 times already. So they buy the tickets, and then they meet with a friend of May's, and this friend is a doctor's wife, and the word that Dmitri uses is doktorsha. So he's also going to use that for the doctor's wife at Sanatorium Shatzel. So that's interesting. We definitely don't have an equivalent for that in English. In German, she would be called the Frau Doktor, even though she wasn't a doctor herself. But yeah, in Russian, they have this diminutive form, doktorsha, unless it was something that Dmitri made up himself, because I have not encountered it elsewhere. And she's a Madame Faber, but clearly she is married, or has married, if she's a widow, to a non-Russian man. She herself is Ukrainian, and she has not lost her accent despite having lived in Paris for 20 years. And Dmitri seems to be pleased with that. As myself being an English as a second language teacher, it always interests me very much to see how some people, they speak with such a pronounced accent in their native language, even after 20 or 30 years in the country that they've immigrated to. And in other cases, people just, it's rare, but there are some people who manage just to sound like native speakers. Well, in the case of Aunt Sonia, despite living in Paris for 20 years, she still has apparently a thick Ukrainian accent. But yeah, anyway, so then the next stop is the Vichfelds, but they're not really it's not good timing for entertaining him because one of Maybelle's children is sick. So Axel and Maybelle were the Vichfelds, and I think these were her children, I think, from a previous marriage or child. And okay, so the most fascinating part of this diary is how much this review means to Dmitri. I don't know how the other people that he was taking and recommending the review to, I don't know how they felt about it, but it seems to really boost his spirits, and that's a little bit odd, really, because you would think it would make him so nostalgic. I mean, other things have. When he was in Tehran and he heard a waltz, a balalaika waltz being played called Vоспоминания Gatchina, Memories of Gatchina, that made him cry. But in this instance, he just cannot get enough of this, and it's like being back in Moscow for him, I think, when he's at this review, and also when he's at the theater itself, because they have this buffet, and they have these waiters who are dressed in something, I can't make the word out, but presumably some kind of traditional Russian garb, serving vodka. And there's this fascinating line about the Moscow spirit. So was Dmitri a Muscovite? Well, yes and no, yes and no. He spent the first 10 years of his life living primarily in St. Petersburg, although he would spend the summers on the Moscow River at Olinskaya. But after 1902, when Paul, his father, left Russia, then he moved to Moscow, and that was where he lived with his uncle and aunt for between 1902 and 1906, the end of 1906, when he and Maria went back to the vicinity of St. Petersburg and lived in Tsarskaya Selo for about 6 months. And during the Second World War, after he'd had this horrible experience at the front and seemed to be suffering from some degree of shell shock or battle fatigue, and was sent off to live at Usovo, his country estate, also on the Moscow River. He would go into Moscow on weekends after he'd recovered somewhat. The symptoms seem to have been largely psychosomatic. And whenever he had a chance to do any entertainment activity or be out for a night on the town, it was in Moscow. So, that's a whole other issue to get into, whether he was, how he could justify doing this during the war if he wasn't really, sick to the extent of being incapacitated. But that's a whole other discussion, which we are not going to get into right now. And if we continue to do this and go back to the start and to the 1915 diaries, then that will be the time to talk about that. But meanwhile, he's got this to cheer him up. And it reminds me of something that he wrote about when he was in London, in 1920, when he found about he found out about his father's death in 1919, I should say. And people were scandalized because he was going off to the theater every night. And he wrote in his diaries that he absolutely understood that, and he knew that it was the wrong thing to do, but he just needed something to cheer him up. And in that instance, I really take that at face value, because it's so clear elsewhere in the diaries how deeply depressed he was, and that was what he needed to do to get by. So I'm not second guessing that. Maybe you feel differently, and if so, that's fine. in this instance, it seems to be having the same effect. You know, he can't sit at home and binge watch his favorite series. So this is what he does to cheer himself up. And while I was looking up Betsy Shuvalova and found out what Sasha Polovtsov had said about her, I decided to read a little more about Dmitri's friend Pete Polovtsov, Sasha's brother, and we saw him one or two diary entries ago. He was a married man. He was married to Mimi, but we saw him off with Dmitri and Bob Luders, spending the night with some women of the evening, or sex workers, or whatever you want to call them. And anyway, I was curious about him, so I looked him up, and I finally have a birth date on him. He was born in 1874, which made him around 47 years old at that time. He was a Genstabist, which means that he was a graduate of the General Staff Academy. So that is always an impressive thing. People who graduated from the General Staff Academy were genuinely the cream of the crop. It was, unlike a lot of the guards and cavalry institutions, the General Staff and the General Staff Academy saw themselves as serious professional career officers. And so you can say just on the face of it that Pete was an intelligent person. You couldn't just go there because you came from a prominent family. And when it came down to doing actual service, he had been with various Cossack units. He'd been with the Wild Division, and he'd been with, I think, some Terek Cossack units, and so that would have appealed to Dmitri. And he and the Polovtsovs were also extremely wealthy, and we see that, unlike Dmitri himself, Pete and Mimi own a villa in or just outside of Monte Carlo. And when it comes to industrialists and people, Russian people in finance and that sort of thing, they're much better connected than Dmitri and Maria are. But again, we can make a value judgment, or we can just leave it be about what Pete was getting up to. And I guess I can't really say he was a bad role model for Dmitri, because Dmitri himself was going to turn 30 that year. So, he was an adult. He was making his own decisions. And yeah, who knows who was the person who was most into that side of life, whether it was he or Pete or both of them equally. Yeah, here I am yammering, so I will stop and come back. These are proving to be interesting diary entries. It's been so long since I've read them that I'm really enjoying it. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.